Thank you for making the time. I'm honored to introduce you professionally, but I'm going to start with a personal introduction that reflects back on my auspicious meeting of you in person. I had already read 2 of your books, and I left a note for you on your workshop space at the Kripalu Yoga Center when we were both teaching at the same time. And months later, a little email popped up in my inbox, and I was so delighted to see your name there. We got to visit by Skype for a few minutes, and then I was delighted to see you in person in the real thing in Portland, Oregon, when you came down to teach for the Addiction and Recovery Conference. What really delighted me was the felt sense of your authenticity and presence, and the way you held the audience, not just in the information you were teaching, but in the actual felt experience you were providing them. It was so phenomenal. I watched people be transformed by your presence as a human being and by your strategic, skillful facilitation of the material that you've come to know and disseminate to so many people.
Kind of you to say so. Thank you.
Yes, it was an inspiration to be in your presence. So let me tell our listeners who you are, since I have a personal connection, but I want to make sure they also understand who you are. Dr. Gabor Mate is a retired physician, a best-selling author. He's worked for 20 years in family practice and palliative care, and for 12 years in addiction medicine in Vancouver's downtown east side. Gabor speaks internationally on mental health, physical health, addiction, and child development. He is the author of 4 books, including When the Body Says No, Exploring the Stress-Disease Connection, and In the Realm of the Hungry Ghosts, Close Encounters with Addiction. Both of those books are books that I recommend to my students all the time, like frequently, consistently, one might even say compulsively. When they start reading them, there are 2 things I hear back from them. One is it's emotionally difficult for them in realizing their own material is getting stimulated, in realizing they're not the only person struggling, and the countless numbers of people who actually are struggling. And the second thing they say to me is how powerful it is that you're as transparent and authentic in the writing as you are, and they feel very hopeful. And so I wonder, Gabor, if you might be willing to share some about your own life events, taking you through your process with addiction recovery and coming into the field of addiction medicine.
I was working in Vancouver's downtown east side, which is North America's most concentrated area of drug use, within a few square block radius. There are thousands of people dependent on heroin, cocaine, crystal meth, every manner of opiate, marijuana, of course alcohol, cigarettes, stimulants, and it's an area, of course, rife with disease, with HIV, with hepatitis C. And the people whose life circumstances are that really they're on the margins of society. But what I realized is I felt very at home there. And that sense of being at home is shared by a lot of people who don't live there, but who do work there, as I did. And what it is that we recognize, as I did in myself, that the patterns of addiction and emotional self-soothing and pain and difficulty and compulsion that my patients so openly exhibited, they exist inside myself as well. And virtually everybody who's called to work in the addiction field has those patterns internal to themselves. Whether they're aware or not is a different question. And very often, when people are not aware that they have the same patterns as their clients, they tend to want to pretend that they're experts and they can tell others what to do and that they know all about it. But really what it is a common humanity that I was actually very glad to recognize. And my addictions now don't show up in the dire and extreme and harmful ways that my clients did. I mean, I don't have HIV, hepatitis C, and I'm a respected and well-remunerated physician. They live in poverty with disease outside the law. But the emotional emptiness, the discomfort, the distress, the desire to escape into addictive behaviors,
Mm-hmm.
then the manipulation and the lying and the inauthenticity that happens as a result of the that desperation to escape,
Yeah.
the consequences of those behaviors on my spiritual life, on my emotional life, on my personal relationships with family and friends, my workaholism, which is another form of escape. These things I fully recognized were in degree much milder, but in real character not different from those of my patients.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
an interesting thing was that when I shared that with my clients, they would nod their heads and say, I totally get it. So when I told them about my compulsive purchase of classical compact discs, was my major self-soother, and how much money I'd spend in a week and how much I'd lie to my wife about it and all that, they, rather than thinking or saying, what's that got to do with our heroin addiction, they would nod their heads and say, yeah, we totally get it.
Mm-hmm.
It's the
Mm-hmm.
same for us.
Yeah.
So it was that recognition in myself of those patterns that was very illuminating. And when I studied the question further, I realized that addiction is a process that affects so many people, maybe in ways that look different. In one person, it might be work, another person, it might be internet, eating, shopping, gambling, or heroin, or cocaine, or crystal meth. But that the brain circuits and the emotional dynamics, spiritual emptiness, and underneath it all, the pain, it's the same for everybody.
Yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm. It's interesting to hear you talk because though we can't see each other, I'm nodding my head a lot.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I was aware of when you said a few minutes back about the experience of our common humanity, and that some of the other providers or practitioners in Vancouver's downtown east side didn't necessarily experience it like a sense of belonging when they went into that environment where you described it as you felt at home there.
I felt at home right away. It's not unique to me, actually, but I certainly was a strong experience for me. When I was asked to work down there, and I visited this flea-bitten, downtrodden hotel that at one point been elegant, but that was a long time before. And now it was a place where people who otherwise would be in the street were being housed. I did feel home right away. I just felt, yeah, I belong here.
How do you imagine that you came to be a person who could feel your shared humanity so readily and openly, where other people flinch in that process? And I'm not saying that it's unique to you or I. I'm glad there's other people who also feel that sense of shared humanity. But I know some people don't have that direct experience and they wonder how to get there, and how did it happen for you or for somebody else that you could feel that so viscerally and relatively promptly.
Well, that sense of identifying with or seeing my commonality with the outsider, that wasn't new for me.
Mm-hmm.
That's been my life experience. I mean, um, being born Jewish in Hungary during the war, and then a degree of anti-Semitism after the war, the sense of being an outsider, and therefore knowing what it's like to be discriminated against. I had a sense of that.
Mm-hmm.
Number two, then I come to North America where I'm an immigrant. So again, that sense of an outsider and identifying with people who are perceived to be on the outside, that it wasn't a new experience. And all my life I've had an interest in what makes people behave the way they do.
Mm-hmm.
And really, given that the shared humanity is just the reality, it's just an absolute natural, physiological, spiritual reality. When people don't see it, it's only because they're protecting themselves against their own pain.
Yeah.
So the pain is fairly common and fairly it's shared. How we cope with the pain, that's a matter of individual history. So some people deal with that pain by not wanting to feel it and by not wanting to acknowledge it, and therefore they want to see themselves as different from those that are openly in pain.
Right.
And so really, And then the one way to do that, of course, is you become an expert and you put on a white coat, and then you know what's wrong with the other person, and you never have to consider that what you're seeing in the other also exists in you. And those experts can actually do a lot of harm,
Yeah.
um, because of, not because they intend to, but because their attitude is fundamentally one of superiority.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And now, if you look at who the addict is, invariably they are hurt, traumatized people who already feel inferior.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's what they grew up feeling about. That's what they grew up feeling about themselves. Now you confront them with an authority figure who exudes an air of superiority simply to cover up his or her own inferiority. But to the addicted person, they reinforce their deep shame about themselves.
Yeah.
So this way, experts, despite whatever the knowledge they have, unless they really deal with their own stuff, can actually hurt people, and
Yeah.
often they do.
Yeah, as you're talking, I just finished teaching a 4-day intensive here on hunger, hope, and healing, and I was working solely with women who are alumni from the program. So
Mm-hmm.
we have a really strong existing foundation. And
Mm-hmm.
one of the practices that we were doing on a daily basis was really looking at what I call our inner community. And I'm reflecting as you're speaking on my inner community when I was in my addiction, that I had the internal voice that was superior and would shame other parts of my inner community. I had the
Right.
part that felt inferior and vulnerable, the part that was in a lot of pain, the part that figured out how to soothe pain and to do that with food and compulsive exercise. And
Yeah.
I had the part that knew this was kind of messed up. And all those pieces were in there. Kind of, some had more real estate in my brain than others, and some spent more time harassing me than others. But I was pretty internally conflicted and isolated from the world at large. I could not see my common humanity at that time. My
Mm.
addiction closed me in to the inner community pain that I was trying to navigate.
Well, actually, you know what? To put it another way, that isolation precedes the addiction.
It did.
Uh, in other words, when people feel connected, they don't need to be addicted. You know,
Right.
so an isolation, that kind of psychic isolation, really is an outcome of trauma. So in fact, trauma really means a disconnect from yourself and your community and your environment. And so the common factor in addiction is actually trauma, which is a realization that's scientifically incontrovertible. The epidemiologic evidence
Right.
is overwhelming, and which and this is something that most addiction counselors and especially addiction physicians absolutely ignore, or not even ignore. They're not even aware of it. So I received an email yesterday from somebody who's just written a book. Her brother committed suicide after years of alcoholism.
Hmm.
There was significant childhood trauma. In decades of visiting experts and counselors, nobody had asked about trauma.
Hmm.
Nobody. And I hear this over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And so that what I'm saying is that disconnect that you were talking about in yourself is is the trauma itself, and so that the addiction imposes a kind of isolation, but isolation also precedes the addiction.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm kind of curious all the time about people's life spectrums, and I want to ask you a specific question. But
Mhm.
I want to say for the listeners that what I became aware of in my own life was uh, the isolation was so multifaceted. I'm an identical twin, which
Mm.
means we came from the same eggs, split into two, and we shared an embryonic sac, and we were born prematurely. So then they separated us into incubators. This was
Yes,
1968, where they also didn't touch babies in incubators. We
that's right.
didn't go home for quite some time, and when we went home to a depressed mother and a father who was in Vietnam.
Mm.
That turned into further complications as our lives unfolded, of course, but the numbers of ways in which I experienced isolation and then reinforced it by looking like the person who, quote unquote, belonged the most. My sister and I were valedictorian and salutatorian in high school. We were the first chair French horn and trumpet players in the state of New York. We were highly accomplished athletes. We looked like we had connection, but inside, my own sense of isolation was pretty great, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And the question I want to ask you, because we just used the word trauma, and I know that both of us have an interest in unpacking that for people to learn from it, I wonder if you could talk about the nature of developmental trauma and even intergenerational lineage of traumatic unfoldings, rather than just the listener who hears it as there was an acute trauma that they may or may not be able to relate to.
Well, first of all, we have to understand, again, when I talk about trauma, I'm not talking about an event, and I'm not talking about even a series of events. I'm talking about what happens inside the person as a result of that event or those events.
Yeah.
So that in your case, the abrupt separation from your birth mother and from your twin,
Yeah.
significant trauma at a time when really you should still be in the womb.
Yeah.
And held and connected and kept warm and secure and absolutely safe. Then not being touched. The child's need is to be touched. I mean, that's just a human need for proper brain development and emotional unfolding. If all that happened to you is that you weren't touched, that itself would be enough.
Mm-hmm.
Now then, the child's personality and emotional life and her brain develops an interaction with the mothering parent. And physiologically, which brain circuits develop and which chemicals will be present in what quantities depends very much on the responsiveness of the adult environment to the infant and the child. So a depressed mother, and we're not blaming mothers here, by the way, nobody chooses to be depressed. Nobody's intending to hurt anybody, least of all her own offspring.
Right.
But the reality is that we know from many studies and just from human experience that a depressed mother can't respond to the infant the way the infant needs. Mm-hmm. As much as she wants to, she can't. And the mother's depression actually shows up in the brain circuits of the infant. We know that too. So we're not talking about people doing bad things to you. In the downtown east side where I worked, bad things happened to my clients. Not a single female patient in 12 years that I worked with had not been sexually abused. Mm-hmm. And the large-scale studies show that in populations of addicted women, a large percentage were sexually abused, for example. But those terrible things don't have to happen. All that has to happen in the sensitive infant, especially to induce pain, is lack of developmental conditions, and that's what we call developmental trauma.
Right.
So when the infant's distress is not responded to by the environment, that's developmental trauma. Now, the trauma, again, is not what happens externally or what doesn't happen. It's what happens inside the person. What happens inside the person is when your emotions are not being held, and when you're not being held the way you need to be, you disconnect from yourself as a way of enduring the stress.
Yeah.
That disconnection is the trauma. And once you disconnect, you're isolated.
Yes. Yeah.
And so now how it works multi-generationally is your mother herself, because if she was depressed, it meant at some point she herself had been traumatized. Now her trauma shows up in a form of postpartum depression, and which, by the way, is not her internal pathology purely. What's happening is she's got no support. Her husband is away in a foreign conflict, mm-hmm. possibly in danger of his life. Can you imagine her mind state? Mm-hmm. You know, very similar to the mind state of my mother in the Second World War, with my father being away.
Yeah.
You know, and but also, if she's depressed, she's pushing down her feelings, which meant that that's the pattern she developed as a child in response to whatever was happening with her. And so we pass on that traumatic impact, not intentionally to our children, or we receive it from our parents due to no intentional harm on their part. It's just automatic. Not only that, not only is the psychological, emotional trauma passed on that way, but physiologically, trauma can alter not the genes of a person, but how those genes are activated or inactivated. So the traumas of grandparents can physiologically be passed on to the offspring, even if the offspring never meets their grandparents.
Right. Yeah.
So it's very complex, but the point is it's not personal. Nobody does it to anybody, and nobody has it done to them personally. It's just what happens. And even in the overt case, when a parent, say, sexually abuses a child, I don't know I can say this to make it clear, but no parent actually intends to abuse the child. The parent is not thinking of it in terms of abuse.
Mm-hmm.
The parent is simply acting out something that happened to them. They're compelled to do that.
Yeah.
And so it's not that they have an intent to harm. They may even love the child in their own way. I know this is strange to say, but I'm just telling you what I know. So ultimately, for me, it's not about blaming anybody or any generation or any offspring. It's just understanding how human pain is currency that unfortunately we bequeath to the next generation.
Right.
And until we deal with it, we're going to continue to pass it on pretty much. The recovery then has to do with regaining that lost connection to oneself and to one's environment.
Yes, yeah. You said that so well about developmental trauma. I'm really glad that I asked you, and I'm using that technological naming, developmental trauma, because a lot of times I'm from the generation of people getting into the self-help movement in my early 20s, where we had to look for the thing that had happened, like
the terrible thing that happened.
what went on. And I was talking recently with one of my colleagues who's also been one of my teachers. Her name is Bonnie Badenoch, and she's a part of the interpersonal neurobiology community in Portland and Vancouver, Washington State. And
Okay.
we were saying how sometimes the more painful experience that the adult is having is trying to look back and figure out, well, what happened? Why am I like this? I can't see any explicit event. Therefore, it must be something just about me, like my basic innate state is
Yeah.
flawed and depressed and isolated, because they couldn't name the thing that happened. And a question I'd like to ask you is, how much do you sense that needing to know through the left brain gets in the way? And how might we make use of the felt sense of things through the right brain, as it were, to realize our process towards recovery?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. First of all, we have to understand that two things can go wrong. One is when bad things happen that shouldn't, but the other is when good things don't happen that should have.
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
usually the people that you're describing are in that second category.
Yes.
So they keep looking for this terrible thing, and it doesn't show up. And they say, oh, well, I must be a screwed up person in my own right. I tell you, it never takes me longer than 3 minutes with a person like that to show them exactly what happened.
Right. I saw you do that in Portland.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's only because it's so obvious.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not perhaps perceivable by the individuals because they're so close to it. But usually it's not even that difficult to tease it out. Number one. Number two, if you cannot find it, no matter how you try, and again, I think that's just for lack of astute counseling, but if you cannot find it, just look at the next time you're upset with somebody. That'll tell you exactly what happened to you.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, what you said about the felt sense, which is the physical state that we can tap into, like any moment of upset, whether it's car rage or whether it's being upset at somebody stepping in front of you in the supermarket, or whether it's something your spouse said to you or a friend or whatever. If you forget what the story is, in other words, forget the incident, just check in with the felt sense in the body and the discomfort, which might be tightness in your chest, which might be tightening or swirling in your belly or tension in your jaw, like whatever it is there, whatever the felt sense is that you can literally feel in the body when you tap into it, that's an actual memory.
Yeah.
It's not a memory with recall, but that's a memory.
Mm-hmm.
You can just guarantee it. So whenever you're upset in the present, you think you're upset about something in the present, you never are. So the felt sense of the upset, the physical resonance in the body itself at that moment is pure memory
Hmm.
being triggered by something that resembles the original incident.
Yeah.
And so understanding that, it just doesn't take long ever to identify somebody's primal hurt.
Hmm.
It's just not a difficult thing at all.
Yeah. I actually use the same word to describe it frequently, the word primal. And that our, even in fact, our primitive brain is there to help us, alert us to circumstances that need our attention.
Well, and life keeps throwing us circumstances so that
Again and again.
until you work this out, you're going to get upset over and over and over again, you know,
Yeah. Yes.
and you think, oh my God, why is life so difficult?
Uh-huh.
Well, life's so difficult because something inside you is guiding you to situations to remind you of what you've forgotten.
Yes. We just worked on this morning with my class here at Kripalu, my Hunger, Hope, and Healing class. And
Great.
one of the things we're also working with, when that thing emerges, that felt sense emerges, I like to ask my students, and I'll ask you this question, and what next to bring connection back to that emerging activation, back to that
Well, that
aspect of ourselves?
well that takes us back to developmental trauma.
Hmm.
Uh, when we talked about trauma, it was that disconnection from the self, right?
Yeah.
Why did we disconnect? Because it was too painful, too difficult to bear. When we become aware of that felt sense in the present, we need to be with it and hold it.
Hmm.
In other words, we need to provide to ourselves that which our environment did not give us when we were small. And so when I do my workshops or you do your classes or workshops, um, it's not about the didactic learning. It's really about helping people reconnect with themselves.
Yeah.
That's the healing. That's the healing. And
Yeah.
that's the good news, you know, because even if you can't recall the incidents, it doesn't matter so much. Although, again, as I say, it's not that difficult. Um, but the issue is that if the problem resided in what happened decades ago, in not being held, in a parent being depressed, a father being a workaholic, an uncle sexually abusing you, if that's what the problem was, then we're sunk because we can never go back and undo it. But if the trauma was not those things, but the trauma, in fact, was that disconnect from the self, well, as long as you can tap into your body and your emotions, you can still reconnect
Hmm.
with the right guidance in the right environment. And that is the healing of trauma, is that reconnection.
Yeah. And one of the things you just said there, I think, is so critical to understand, particularly if a listener for our conversation is in a vulnerable period of their work, is that in the right environment at the right time, in a conducive environment with enough safety, enough attunement and resonance and care, that something can be made good use of rather than just have another experience of pain that they want to further disconnect from.
Right. And, you know, from that point of view, people actually need to appreciate their addictions,
Hmm.
not not as something that they want to engage in or further, but certainly as something that, for the lack of anything better, helped them deal with the pain.
Yeah.
When they were not ready, didn't have the support, the understanding to be with that pain, the addiction helped them escape from it. And that's the purpose of addiction. So I don't look at addiction as a disease. I mean, it's got features of a disease and certainly it can cause a lot of harm. But the original intent and the original drive to soothe the pain simply was a survival instinct.
Yeah, I call those survival strategies. And one of the things I was doing in my recovery, I was kind of blindly moving towards whatever relief I could find because I knew I didn't want to be caught up so much in my robotic eating disorder behaviors anymore. And
Yeah.
shortly after discovering this thing that I called stretching, stretching and breathing, which is now called yoga,
Mm.
I also was in art therapy school at the time, and I did a lot of drawing and painting and personal work in that regard. But I had this instinct to turn to what I called at the time my longtime companion, which was my eating disorder.
Mm-hmm.
I called her the LTC, longtime companion. And I would
Mm.
write her these letters of appreciation. Thank you so much for trying to help me. And I
Mm.
and through these letters of appreciation, I was also saying, and I'm outgrowing you, and it's time for me to say goodbye to the painful parts of you, and yada yada. And I actually would go to these places in nature and have like a little ceremony, as if you were having a funeral of sorts. And
Mm.
I was just sort of stumbling through whatever I could come up with when I was 20 or 22 years old, and try to find out, how do you navigate that this has been a relationship. It's been a really important relationship, and it's really helped me, soothed me, taken care of me when I didn't know what else to do, and that I
Yes.
wanted to find new skills, and so on. So I called her my longtime companion, and I had several letters I wrote to her.
Mm.
I smile at my younger self to find out like these creative ways to do something different.
Well, it's very interesting. I call those old patterns that we adopt. I don't even call them strategies because strategy implies something conscious,
Mm-hmm.
and these are not conscious dynamics for the most part, but these dynamics that we develop or adopt. I call them the stupid friend. You call it the long-term companion. Uh, Stupid friend because it was trying to help, and at some point actually did help.
Yeah.
Stupid because it's incapable of learning. It's not capable of getting that its services are now being actually counterproductive, and that you don't need them anymore. And so it's his friend, and it's stupid. So but you're not angry with the stupid friend. You're very patient with it. You just say, "Listen, buddy,
Mm-hmm.
thank you, but no thanks." But there's no shame or hostility towards it.
That's the big difference. And in my book, I teach these things I call four essential life skills. And the third essential life skill is called moving from love, not shame.
Mm-hmm.
Rather than even shaming the behavior or shaming myself for having the behavior or shaming the part of me that felt ashamed, that's really like often say like being exonerated, the the sentence I was putting on myself about it all.
That's right.
You were talking earlier, Gabor, about workaholism, and that before we started our conversation formally and the recording, you were mentioning also that in the process of writing a book, you wanted it to flow enough that if it's not flowing, you're able to put it aside. How did you go from the mechanism of workaholism to the feeling that intuition and flow had to be there for writing?
Well, my workaholism applied to how I approached medical work, and I'd
Mm-hmm.
take on too much. I'd not say no to new clients. I would allow the beeper to dominate my life, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and that was all a way of adding to my importance, which I didn't believe in fundamentally.
Mm-hmm.
Writing for me is different. Writing for me is not a it's not a workaholic thing for me. Writing it's a creative thing, and it's when I have something to express, when I have something new to say, something important to say, something I believe would help people, something that I need to express about myself or my understanding of the world. When that's not flowing, I don't write. So recently, I tried to work on my fifth book, which I've given a lot of thought and a lot of research, but it just wasn't coming. Just what I was writing wasn't inspiring me, so I stopped.
Mm-hmm.
And I need to really let it live inside me for a while longer and see if it'll flow again. But that's not something I can approach in a workaholic fashion. I mean, if I did, I'd be doing violence to myself and to the
Right,
book,
right.
and to the book itself, actually.
Mm-hmm. Yes, what would want to come through you would not come through as well in in that with that attitude.
That's right.
Mm. I know that a lot of people that I've worked with over the years struggle with allowing themselves to have that kind of intuitive, kind, nurturing attitude towards their endeavors, whether they're personal, professional, on behalf of humanity, or a hobby at home. They struggle to have that attitude that you're talking about right now in relationship to book writing. Is that an attitude that you had to grow into? Did you cultivate it somehow?
Actually, for me, it's different. For me, the writing just doesn't work unless that flow is there. It just doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when it comes to book writing, the people that you're talking about, um, they're they're looking for something more than just expression in their writing. They're looking for validation of themselves, and they think, okay, if I'm not writing, I'm just not worthy.
Mm-hmm.
That's what the struggle comes from. So they need to separate their desire and even need to express themselves from that being their way of making their existence worthwhile.
Yeah. Which actually ties back into the original recognition of isolation and the need for connection.
Yes.
Yeah. Would you
And
say that as humans we have like primal hungers for things like connection, or and it would you put affirmation or appreciation or that kind of spectrum in there?
well, hunger is a good way to put it. I mean, hunger is simply nature's way of telling us that we need something.
Yeah.
So if we weren't hungry, we wouldn't eat, and if we wouldn't eat, we wouldn't survive. So the hunger expresses not a choice of any kind, it expresses a need. Now, developmentally, and also just to stay alive, human infants need connection. I mean, it's just that simple. They're utterly helpless, immature, um, dependent, fragile creatures. So the hunger for connection is no less important than a hunger for food. And infants denied that connection, if they're ultimately denied connection at all, even if they're fed and so on, they'll die.
Yeah.
So that we're talking about a developmental need, just as we're talking about thirst or hunger. So they need to be touched, they need to be connected with. And of course, those needs transcend into the emotional realm of being held emotionally, which means being accepted and validated and even enjoyed for healthy development. Those are human needs.
Yeah. I would echo that certainly.
And when those needs are not met, you're going to get distortions of development, which will show up in the form of mental illness, addiction, physical illness, behavior problems, relationship problems, and so on, all of which ultimately reflect developmental issues. Virtually all of them. I mean, when it comes to physical illness, if you were in Hiroshima when it was being bombed, you would just got sick because of the radiation,
Mm-hmm.
and somebody injects you with the HIV virus. Um, you know, you might get the infection simply because of some external event that happened. But most chronic illnesses actually are reflections of that childhood disconnection, unmet needs.
Yeah, yes. We talk about that in yoga as well. And one of the sort of quandaries that I've seen in the yoga, I'm going to say industry, because in the time that I've been part of the yoga community, it's really come into this big industry. One of the paradoxes is that we were taught 20, 30, 40 years ago that we were practicing so that we could transcend the self, small
Yes.
s, and to experience the self, big S. And yet so many people today come into the practice community not knowing where their sense of self is, maybe not having a cohesive sense of self, and not knowing what transcendence of that means. And it can be something a little bit dicey where people start using the word ego in kind of unfortunate or inappropriate ways, even describing themselves. And I wonder if you've had any intersection with that particular part of our yoga community, and if you have any comments back about that.
Well, I'm not sure I fully get the question, Sarahjoy. Can you can you summarize it for me?
Yeah, I can give you a couple of examples because students come and they'll say, "Oh, I should overcome my ego. I should have less ego about this." And yet,
Okay.
when I'm sitting with them, my sense is they haven't actually become able to rest in their innate self, or they don't have a cohesive sense of self, so they're trying to transcend before I would recommend that. And simultaneously, there is this practice we call karma yoga or selfless service, which helps us connect back to our countless seen and unseen others in the family of humanity. So people are dancing between those two things, not quite knowing how to understand it.
Yes, well, words like ego and so on, these are difficult concepts and we all mean different things by them, but I don't believe in fighting the ego or suppressing it or trying to get rid of it. The ego really developed as a defensive mechanism,
Mm-hmm.
precisely because we felt hurt. So the ego is our attempt to compensate for the hurt. So rather than trying to fight the ego, how about just trying to heal the hurt underneath it? Then the ego doesn't need to be so active anymore. It is possible for people to make spiritual decisions or engage in what they think are spiritual actions as a way of transcending their ego um, by will,
Mm-hmm.
but that literally just doesn't work over time.
No.
And because it doesn't deal with the pain and that's underneath it. And so that's what's been called a spiritual bypass. And that happens a lot in the meditation community and the yoga community and in the addiction community. So people are trying to bypass something that really they have to go through and deal with.
Yeah. That's what I've seen also. I used to live in spiritual community and I was young at the time and kind of early in my recovery, and we had a language about this sort of thing, and it never quite felt like it fit my experience, and I didn't actually end up adopting that language culture. But then as I became a yoga teacher and I started hearing both colleagues and students talking in this way, I thought there's something a little bit off here, because how they're describing ego is actually a complex structure of primal need and personal expression. And a lot of those expressions are asking us to turn towards them with warmth and understanding and curiosity,
Yeah,
not with a demand to quote unquote get rid of it.
that's right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's wonderful to talk with you and have this kind of resonance. I'm sorry we can't actually see each other, because you'd see me smiling and nodding on a regular basis.
I'll have to imagine you doing that.
Yeah. I wonder if there's one thing you might leave our listeners with in terms of if they're right now struggling with a sense of isolation or shame, some suggestion you might make for them that they could do in the immediacy of hearing us talk in this moment
Yeah,
itself.
yeah. Well, isolation and shame are both perceptions. They're not realities. They're perceptions. I mean, one can be alone and not be isolated. So, yeah, you might be alone right now, but that doesn't mean you're isolated.
Mm-hmm.
And so these are perceptions. Shame is based on some belief, some perception that there's something wrong with you. And what I'm suggesting is that we talked about this earlier, both shame and isolation, they leave a certain, not they leave, they evoke or they are words for a certain physical experience that's occurring for you right now, which is happening in your body. So the thing is to tap in with the body right away, not to try and think your way out of those states, but to recognize that those states are actually memories. Mm-hmm. This is the showing up.
And if somebody learned to use dissociation like early in life as a way...
Well, I did. I did. Dissociation is my main method of coping. So that's why attention deficit disorder, which is characterized by absent-mindedness, tuning out, is the most common dissociative disorder.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't start off as, it's not a disease. What it actually is an attempt to cope with overwhelming stress. So it tunes out, dissociates, and that becomes programmed into their brain as their brain is developing. Now they got ADD. But really what's going on is they're terrified of the present moment. Mm-hmm. Because when they're small and helpless, the present moment was so unbearable. That was my situation. So, yeah, again.
Yeah.
For that, and I can even now, I can meditate and do my breathing, and my mind be somewhere else entirely. It's very easy for me.
When you first started coming back into your body, as it were, then as a person who learned to dissociate, did you experience what I call this the pain of homecoming? Like, okay, I'm coming back home, and there's something poignant and tender about that. If I've been away from home for a long time, if I've been dissociating, did you have any experience like that?
I've heard people talk about that, but not for me. See, dissociation can be so profound that you're not actually aware of feelings, you know?
Yeah.
And So for me, where it shows up is in interaction with other people. So when I feel pain or sense of rejection or anything like that, say my marriage, well, that's the old stuff showing up. That's where I know what I'm still carrying.
Mm-hmm.
I've had not that experience of sort of tender recognition. That's just not an experience that I've had.
Mm-hmm. And for people listening, since you and I have had some personal and professional experience, and you've had years of your own personal growth, does it get better? People ask me this question all the time. They say, does it get better?
Well, let me put it this way. Do you become more free of these patterns? Yes, you do.
Yeah, that's the question that they're asking.
When they arise, do you have more power, more skill, more presence to deal with them? Yes, you do.
Yeah.
Do they ever completely disappear? I'm only 72. Let me tell you, in 10 years, if I'm still around, I have no idea. I think for some people they do. I
Mhm.
think for most of us, it's a process, but it's a process of empowerment and presence,
Yeah.
and which certainly reduces the suffering. And as far as suffering is concerned, again, that's only wrong if we make it wrong. So the one I'm reading a book right now called The Presence Process, and I'm doing the work in the book. And Michael Brown, the author, says it's not a matter of feeling better; it's a matter of getting better at feeling.
Yeah. Yeah. I know this book. Yeah. That's great.
And so, yeah. If that's how we define getting better, the answer is yes.
Hmm.
If you define getting better by am I never going to feel sad again, and I'm never going to have anxiety again, uh, good luck.
Right.
And some people, do get totally enlightened. They really do. And then, those things take on a totally different coloration.
Mhm.
When I have that experience of total enlightenment, I will be sure to call you.
Okay. Yeah. I often say, I don't know if I imagine that you might have had this opportunity. I'm not sure. I've been with the Dalai Lama a few times over in
Yeah,
Dharamsala, and I
yeah.
often refer to his ability to laugh and also to cry,
Mm.
to feel the tenderness and the sorrow, and yet to stay so expansive at the same time. And I'm laughing when you say to our listeners, if you define getting better as I'll never feel sad or anxious again, I revel in feeling my sadness so much that, or my poignancy, and I enjoy it so much that I have a habit of going onto YouTube and looking for videos that I call videos for laughing and crying. I even play them for my students in our group sessions so we can look at all the characters in this particular video. Let's say it's Britain's Got Talent. And there's the nervous mother, and there's the nervous auditionee, and there are the judges, and there's the audience, and there's a little narrative about it, and you can hear right away the sniffles in the room. And we watch together, we cry together, we feel the poignancy together, and I say, and how was it to breathe and coexist with that? And people find that they outlived it, they did it, they got through it, and I
Mm.
say, in the
So, so,
same way,
so it's kind of like practice for real life. Is that what it is?
we're practicing.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. In the novel The Tin Drum by Günter Grass, um, there's a scene where this is post-war Germany, and there's a lot of tears that haven't been shed. So people go to this cellar restaurant where there's this band that plays music, uh, and the owner brings out onions, and everybody puts onions at the when they chop up the onions, so they start crying, and this is their way of trying to release some of the grief, of
Yeah.
course, that they carry.
Hmm. Yeah,
So
I
I don't know that in my life I need to do that. I mean, plenty of stuff happens. Thank you very much. That I don't know
You
if
don't
I
need
need
the
to look.
onions?
I don't need the onions. I'm not sure I need the videos either.
Well, I'll
But
send you one that I just played. You can tell me what you think about it. So
okay,
I'll
all right,
I'll tell you in the email when I send it why I was playing it, and you can tell me what you think. It's not a long video, but I'll look forward to
sure,
hearing what you say about it. Um,
all right.
yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. Well, it's really wonderful to talk with you, Gabor, and I just so appreciate that our listeners will have a chance to hear your wisdom and your genuineness and your really deep and loving perspective on our human journey.
Well, thank you. Thanks very much. Nice to speak with you.